Before we get to today's show on what it means to be a tradition, I have some community notes. Friend of the show, Robbie the Hermetic Hipster, is funding art for a new guide to the traditions on Patreon that will be released on the Storyteller Vault. Art's pretty expensive, so if you'd like to help Robbie's work and want to get that STV book made, go to patreon.com/thehermetichipster, or go to the link in the show notes. Whereas by Night is offering a new Spanish-language podcast on werewolves called Nacion Garu. I listened to it at 1.5 speed, which is how I listen to pretty well everything, and my Spanish is still terrible, and I think my head popped off. If you have any interesting mage projects that you'd like the world to know about, drop us a line, magethepodcast@gmail.com, and include community notes in the subject line. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson, and today on Mage the Podcast, we're discussing the topic of what the heck is a tradition, and that is something that requires consideration and understanding and the ability to sound both academic and approachable. And when I think about those topics together, I think Victor Kinzer, and Victor is our guest today. Victor, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for that very flattering introduction. Yeah.
It's not flattery if it's true. I've been enjoying walking away from Arcadia's walk through the canon for Changeling. That's been great. I am currently waiting for Hunter's Augment to finish because I found that I very much enjoy shotgunning actual plays, but I look forward to that finishing so that I can start. And for those of you who are not familiar, Walking Away from Arcadia is a wonderful podcast on Changeling the Dreaming, and probably one of the most well-considered critiques of a World of Darkness game that's out there. People are interested in finding out more. How can they do that?
You can go to walkingawayfromarcadia.podbean.com. You can also look up Walking Away from Arcadia on Facebook. We always post new episodes there. And since you mentioned Hunter's Augment is a 6-episode actual play of a game that Simon released onto the Storyteller's Vault that we did a previous Mage the Podcast episode on, called Changeling Countless Dreams. And it's all about science fiction changelings. So not in the future, not in a science fiction setting, but what if all the stories of science fiction emerge out of the dreaming in their own right, and what would that look like? So we did an actual play. It's actually based off one of the kind of jumpstart one-page scenarios in the book that Simon put out on the Vault.
And I think Countless Dreams is proof that unleashing exists and can occur on the Storyteller Vault. It is just a torrent of what if? And it's pretty spectacular in that regard. And links to all these things will be in the show notes. So one of the questions we were batting around is, what is a tradition? It's changed a bunch across editions, and the definitional parts have also changed. And the working definition of a tradition, I'm at least going to start with, is a tradition generally shows most or all of the following. The first one is a naive one, part of the Council of the Nine Mystic Traditions. That's, if push comes to shove, that's kind of a thing we can go back to. The paradigm generally practiced within that tradition is mystical or at least techno-magical. Paradigm and tradition don't necessarily line up, and I think that's a great thing, but most practitioners in the group tend to fit in one of those two camps. They believe that ascension is possible and generally believe in individual ascension. This is partially what would differentiate the traditions from maybe an alternative group that were mystical but believed in mass ascension. Even the virtual adepts who want to create a new reality believe that they should give everyone that choice. And likewise, the Celestial Chorus is kind of another group where you would think there's a notion of mass ascension, but the Chorus specifically says that they simply want to create a world where those who choose to enter communion with the One have the ability to do that. Now, if they ever got that far, whether or not they would become doctrinaire asshats and force that upon people is a completely different question. And fourth, they are actively participating in the Ascension War. This criteria and the Ascension criteria is kind of, at least in second edition and revised in a bunch of places, what separated a craft from a tradition. The interesting part is in M20, the Disparate Alliance, the collection of crafts that kind of band together against the technocracy, albeit for slightly different reasons, suggests that there is another active participant on the side of balance in the Ascension conflict. But crafts generally don't seek ascension, and I would be fascinated to see some crafts that did, and maybe have another group for that.
I think those are really the best definitions in universe. I think the thing to define a tradition that you have to do, and this is something a lot of players that I've run into don't like doing, is think outside of universe. What went into the game design? What was the actual goal? And if you go all the way back to early first edition before the Book of Crafts came out, and you look at all the stories, some of them may be apocryphal, some of them true, about how that first edition Mage book came out. We all know that Mage was a very different thing than what got released. And then at the last second, after some of the art had come in, they decided, oh, let's change this up. This isn't working. We need to take a different approach. And so the original write-up on the traditions and I think the conventions changed a lot at the very, very end of development. And in that first edition book, to me at least, the traditions really read a bit like character classes. You know, you talked about paradigm being different from the tradition. I think that kind of came later. They are, to me, often big and archetypical, whereas a craft might be about a very specific cultural expression, or it may have grown out of a very, very specific place in the canon. By and large, well, some of the traditions got a little bit of that later. They started as I am all death magic, I am all high ritual magic. And they've changed over time. And how much you do or don't want them to be that, mileage will vary, interpretation will vary. But I think that to be a tradition, you have to be a big tent and have a core archetype in your DNA somewhere. I think that that really defines them in a lot of ways. You know, if you don't want the crafts and you have kind of an oddball character concept, you can still fit them into a tradition. It will still work. I think that flexibility is key.
Yeah, towards the character class notion, the Akashiana in 1E was kind of like, we need a kung fu kick people class, and that's kind of what we got. It does kind of make sense that a lot of the crafts are a somewhat specialized reflection, seemingly, of one of the traditions. So you have the Solificati, or the Children of Knowledge, who are the alchemist variant of the high ritual Hermetics, or you have the explicitly Christian Templars within the Celestial Chorus, or something like that. Or the Bata'a could be kind of a spiritual reflection of the Dream Speakers. I wonder if we kept going through that, if we would be able to come up with kind of correspondences for all or most of them, thinking about it. And when we talk about addition, what makes a tradition has very much changed over time. Like in 1E, metaphysical society was what informed humanity. The Euthanatoi killed liberally, and they were the origin of the idea of reincarnation. It was not that they were informed by Hinduism, but Hinduism was a pale reflection of the enlightened ideal. The Celestial Chorus had kind of their own religion. Virtual adepts had computers beyond mortal computers. So the traditions there were very other. And I think my favorite example of this was the idea that the Dream Speakers were all people who had been tapped by Gaia, and it could occur seemingly at random. The only other time this idea is really taken forward, I think, was in 2E's Book of Mirrors, where it says that all marauders are entities that have been tapped by the wild, like directly. Like the wild said, nope, I want that one, as opposed to just like as a figure of speech. Have you ever run with that? Like that 1E notion of there being kind of sacred hidden knowledge that humanity at large only has a pale reflection of?
I have to admit, I have not. And that's not a read on that particular approach. It's I think a very valid approach, especially if you like big cosmic stories where you want Gaia as a personality to kind of be present, where you want Wild as like a Titan level deity to kind of be present. I tend to run mages as the greatest possible realization of human potential, and played up to fantasy extremes, certainly. But I think this is why I'm so attracted to techno magic. But I do tend to say that the face that is Wild or Weaver or Wyrm is just an anthropomorphizing of something greater to make it comprehensible to werewolves. Not to say it doesn't have a spiritual component, but I do tend to put all the agency in the characters, in the humans, whenever possible.
The other thing that was also kind of interesting is if you believe that the awakened ideal is the truer truth and humans are diluting it, then diversity within a tradition is a failure. If you have 7 different kinds of earth worship all occurring within the verbena, most of them are going to be wrong. So the traditions were much more paradigmatically unified. Sometimes the tools would differ, but each group was kind of like, no, this is how you magic. And within it, the amount of diversity would be quite small. And this absolutely explodes in second edition. What were the big shifts to you between first edition and second edition as it comes to what a tradition is?
The biggest shift actually really came near the end of first edition when the Book of Crafts came out. Um, in preparation for this episode, I went and I checked the dates, and Book of Crafts came out in 1996, and second edition came out in 1997. So they were probably working on second edition, at least conceptually, when they decided let's put crafts into the game. I think second edition was really when they started to move away from tradition as character class. And you start seeing a lot more history. You start seeing conflicts that the traditions were involved in. And as soon as you make them involved in a conflict, as soon as you introduce something like the Akashayana and Chakravanti War, then suddenly you want them to make sense politically. Like you want to be able to put them in a place in your mind, which I think more than anything else, introducing that tension results in a lot of the question mark around what is a tradition? What do we do with them? Are they a group of people that need to make sense politically? Are they the paradigm and the way the world works is the primary thing and ignore everything else? Does that work? So I think really starting to introduce a lot more of that story was the biggest shift between first edition and second edition for me. Technically, it started a little late in first edition, but I think that was really the biggest change.
We abandon the idea that mages have access to sacred knowledge that humans, the rest of humanity, is just kind of missing, and it is kind of the other way, that mages are finding the core, the belief core of a set of practices, and are using that to create magic. There's also an idea that runs around that in 2e you can also kind of look at each tradition by what social role they represent. Like there's this fascinating passage in the Euthanatos book where it talks about the Euthanatos are made up of those who do all the jobs that no one else wants, and that often involves dealing with the dying, tending to the untreatable, disposing of them. The Sons of Ether book talks about the importance of tinkerers, of people who are willing to go what if in a society, and the virtual adepts as the information gatherers and the communicators. And as Victor said, we get the Book of Crafts, which specifically says that the crafts don't take part in the Ascension War necessarily, but even throughout the Book of Crafts, they talk about, oh, the Bata'a have had to deal with the technocracy, and this was the Kopaloi response to Western imperialism and so on. So even that kind of weakens.
Yeah, so one other thing that I think definitely comes into its own in the 2E era, and I think it's worth maybe throwing in what Sorcerer's Crusade did to the traditions by filling out the Fragile Path, is you mentioned that the traditions are all like, no, this is the way magic works, full stop. I actually think that's not totally true. I think that is the crafts. The crafts have, I am part of this super, super tight cultural lineage, and this is how magic works. And up until M20, they didn't really work well with each other, and they didn't work well with the traditions, which is why they didn't join the council at the convocation. The thing about the traditions to me is the fight to get over that impulse, where they see the order of reason, and they were formed in response to the order of reason. And the order of reason took all of these groups and they just cooperate gracefully, perfectly. And I feel like part of what defines the traditions, those were the groups that went, okay, if we're going to fight that, if we're going to keep wonder in the world, we need to be able to do that, and they're bad at it. As opposed to the mystic groups that went, we're not even going to try. And I think there's a really interesting long story that starts with the Fragile Path, which is all about these 9 exceptional avatars of their tradition trying to work together and utterly failing. And then getting into the contemporary setting where it's still hard, but they're finally kind of figuring it out. And when you look at all the work about how do we do a multi-person magical effect when we're all a different tradition, and that's something that happens. That's done. You find ways to reconcile paradigm. I think that's one of the most fun things to do in a game. But the social dynamics that emerge from that are, to me, one of the most fascinating dynamics of the Magic system. I love that sort of narrative. And I think that struggling to do something that they're bad at is kind of what defines the traditions. And I feel like the crafts having that as a center of the narrative and then getting to M20 and the crafts finally realizing, oh God, we really need to cooperate as well, and setting the crafts at the point in that path that the traditions were at when the Fragile Path happened is sort of a fascinating way to create a spectrum between the technocracy to the crafts, with the traditions kind of in the middle. And I think that that is a pretty defining aspect of the traditions and also of the Solificati and the Bettini, because crafts, but not really. They're traditions that don't have a seat at the table anymore. And a lot of those things, like being involved in the big picture Ascension War, being willing to cooperate, the Bettini finally gave up on it, but like it's kind of there in their DNA.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like those things are still there.
Yeah, the Solificati are interesting to me because whenever they're expressed as being alchemists, I feel that the division between the Solificati and the Children of Knowledge isn't always necessarily observed, that you have one group that is very much traditional external alchemy and another group who is trying to perfect Western internal mass alchemy. The idea that you have the Children of Knowledge who are like, no, 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 we are going to figure out how to go through a phase change to make humanity ascend all at once, or at least reach a new level of reality, as opposed to the traditional Solificati attempt at mastering, creating the Philosopher's Stone or what have you. So in a weird way, they are very directly shooting for ascension, but are not participating in the Ascension War in the same way. And then we have the events of the Week of Nightmares. We have the Reckoning metaplot event, and that brings us into Revised. In Revised, we really have an explosion of sects, which are groups within a tradition. So at the idea, you're a mage, and then you have faction, which roughly covers what group within the Ascension War you are, whether that be orphan or craft or tradition or what have you. And then below those, you have sect as kind of the smallest organized group that seemingly gets recognized within the game. And for instance, within the Akashic Brotherhood book, we went from the 4 original sects tied to Essence to something like 8, and several of them have multiple subgroups within them. And at this point in Revised, the tradition almost becomes either political, or to me, the way they phrased it was each tradition was brought together by what is the thing that you need to transcend to achieve personal ascension. So you had the idea that the Verbena wants you to transcend the false comforts of civilization, and the Dream Speakers want you to transcend the limitations of the material world. The Virtual Adepts want you to transcend the substrate of your consciousness. The Order of Hermes wants you to transcend laziness and ignorance. Also with this, the crafts were largely swept away, which is certainly contentious. But at this point, the question really becomes, what is a tradition? Because the Akashiana now includes traditional Shaolin practitioners, Japanese technical executives, as well as a number of other Western contemplative and personal challenge-based ideas. So, like, what really becomes a tradition? It also reinforces the idea that even though the Ascension War is notionally over, everyone is now involved in the Ascension War. No one gets to hide from the modern world. No one gets to just like run away from the technocracy, partially because we lose access to the Umbra, and partially because that's just kind of the environment that the game wants to take. How do you feel about that shift for the crafts and maybe that redefinition of what a tradition is?
I have very mixed feelings about that change because I've run headfirst into the problem of Mage having too many groups and too many factions and it just being overwhelming for a new player. And to me, putting all of the individual groups under the purview of these 9 groups kind of turns it into car design. To share just an article I read years ago, it talked about paralysis of choice. People are really, really bad at designing from scratch. They're horrible at it. And it's not out of a lack of skill. It's about just like being overwhelmed and not even knowing where to start. And that's why, bespoke custom things don't get made very often. Car companies learned is if you only present a tiny choice at a time, you can get all the way to the end of a large customization process and it'll work really well. First, just say, here are 7 styles of car, pick a style. Here's a paint color, pick a paint color. Here's an upholstery option, pick an upholstery option, and people are great at that. And I feel like the revised approach of saying, pick a tradition. Cool, you've picked your tradition. Now, look at all the groups in the tradition. It was a really good game design choice, and it would have been great if we'd started there because you could have taken the traditions and really said, these are not political organizations. These are affiliations of related paradigm, and all the various groups that engage in spirit magic are going to come together, and they do share knowledge. They have tensions as well, but here are the things that bind them, and that works. The problem is it's hard to take what already existed and turn it into that because people don't really want to give up what they had before. So, and then taking the crafts, some of which had explicitly not joined the traditions because there was a cultural statement being made about imperialism. That was a big part of the, no, we're not going to join this. Making a statement like that in one edition and then just saying, oh no, they joined later in another edition, that makes me very uncomfortable. So I like it from a design point of view. I don't think the game was at a point where it could be very cleanly implemented. Mixed feelings.
Got it. So if Mage had started with the idea that there is no order of Hermes in the same way that there is no, like in some multi-party democracies, there is no left, but there are 4 or 5 parties that continually caucus together to make up a left, and that would be your order of Hermes. Like, you could be a hermetic, but you would say your magic is hermetic, but no one would claim to be a member of the order of Hermes. They'd be like, no, I'm part of this house or this group or this other thing. It just so happens that we share a lot of things with these other people, as opposed to it being a title and group unto itself. Is that a reasonable comparison of if it could have been retconned, what that might look like?
Yes, that's very much what I imagine. And there are a lot of particular tensions within the groups that I don't know were ever written. I think some of them exist in my head that model lends itself to playing with. Like, I've always found the whole dynamic with Euthanatoi where we are assassins. We, kill people that need to turn the wheel, but also Greek necromancy. And it's like Greek necromancy is literally diving into the world of the dead for information. Greek necromancers didn't kill people. And just the idea of, you're going to have the Euthanatoi that are bad at the good death. And if you've ever played with the Euthanatoi, they don't take spirit. They don't make sure that those people don't become specters. I've yet to find a Euthanatoi player that actually does that. I love the idea that the necromancers and the wheel-turning assassins are part of a meta group, but they have their own frustrations with each other. And I feel like that structure would lend itself to telling those sorts of stories in a way that the traditions as they're written, like, they've tried to carve out a space for that, but it's really hard to tell those stories.
The Society of Ether Necronaut, who just considers the underworld this other realm, could get together with those who do the Agamate or something like that. It sometimes makes a lot more thematic sense. I think the one that always got me was the division within the Cult of Ecstasy, the Sahaja. The idea that we have this group that is both seers, like in the traditional sense, SEER, people who plumb through time, and people who explore the extents of the senses. Because in a lot of cases, people who believe in like mystically traveling liminal spaces and so on do so through denying sensation, not through embracing it. Like, your goal is to remove as many possible distractions so you can wander the timeline or something like that, as opposed to being like, let's do a fork truck full of Molly and see if that helps us figure out how things are going. That to me was one of those things where, like, how did these two get together during the Grand Convocation? I think almost literally every tradition has that, in the same way that you have the group of virtual adepts that don't necessarily use computers too much. You have the chalkboard or whiteboard faction within them that maybe would fit better with the Hermetics practically. And when I think of revised, I think the other thing is there's that other imperialist theme of we are going to run around and loot other cultures for magic. And it goes back and forth between trying to present things in terms of, oh, magic can be found anywhere and everyone's road is valid, to, okay, the Egyptians are gone, we can steal their stuff. And I don't think that is a needle that was always thread correctly. Like, only in my second reading of Dead Magic was I like, oh, this is bad. You've presented the beliefs but not the people. You've missed the point.
I totally agree with that. And I feel like Mage is still struggling to find that balance. I like the direction M20 took with it, but it's still challenging to take, especially with the traditions, a group and say, yes, we represent, say, the Celestial Chorus, every single monotheistic, vision of the one, but we're also this political organization in the process of rebuilding our council. And it's hard to make that work if you stare at it too hard, because if you stare at it too hard, you start recognizing how many legitimate tensions you're just kind of erasing and wiping away, and how you can't really represent certain people accurately and do that. And I think that's just some of the stuff that's in the DNA of the traditions, and it's hard to navigate.
How do you balance that, the power of representation, by getting a bunch of people that agree with you? In general, you're better at getting what you want, versus a level of aggregation at which that suddenly becomes useless. Now, in M20, what changes to you in M20 regarding what traditionhood or what crafthood means?
For me, the crafts changed dramatically in M20. I mean, they were massively reinvented because prior to M20, they were all kind of stuck in a time. They all had different cultural versions of Noble Savage going on. And that was explicitly swept away. You suddenly have Technomancer Toftani, and you have these very sort of urban feeling, Batin. They felt much more like they fit in this current urban fantasy kind of setting. I think the traditions changed less. There was a similar attempt to make them feel more up to date, but I think taking all of that revised consolidation out, where, okay, yes, the Bata are still on their own, and the Solificati are still the children of knowledge, and allowing the traditions to stand on their own, but also kind of come into their own. The thing I always think about is that picture, the art for the Choir Celeste in M20, where they had always been nuns or priests, and then you have this Christian rocker. And I think there was less structural change to the traditions, but more just allowing them to be something contemporary. That term tradition invokes, we are the old magical, we are preserving what was. And that's an intrinsically, small c conservative mindset. And the technocracy was pushing towards the future and wanting to change, towards this other thing and then crystallize it and make it perfect. But really, that tension was always a little false. And I feel like M20 turned it into, we want to keep the spirit of what was good about these old things alive, but reinvent it. I guess the thing that I would think about is, I used to be a practicing neo-pagan, and I always struggled with this idea of the uber traditional pagan. I practice the old ways. And spoiler, neo-pagans have neo in the word because no, you don't.
Yeah.
And what all of those people, hundreds, thousands of years ago, were doing were coming to a spiritual place and having an engagement with spirituality that spoke to their existence in that moment. And if all you do is look backwards and try to recreate, you are never doing that thing. And that is the thing that matters. And I felt like M20 was the first time I saw right up on the traditions that really said, okay, I want to take the wisdom that was developed, but then I want to engage with it in a way that speaks to where I am now. And really got to, okay, we're kind of figuring out how to cooperate. And part of that is the council shattering. And we're now really thinking about, well, what do we need to do to build a new council? Should we just recreate it? That's always been our mission statement, but we haven't done it yet because, like, is that the right mission statement? And I think being at that crux, that moment, and having not just gone back to recreate what was, is the biggest defining change of the traditions. And to me, it makes them speak to something that I actually relate to in a way the prior tradition write-ups never really did.
It gets rid of the diversity to me that was baked into revised. So when something is fundamentally political, the implementation or the expression of it can vary widely as long as everyone's kind of pushing in the same direction. It is interesting that the traditions to me in M20 kind of become narrower. Like the Celestial Chorus through 1E and 2E was not actually that hierarchical. Like it had a curia, but the idea of there actually being a proper hierarchy in any reasonable way was never really filled out. And in revised, everything is broken. To me, in M20, it is returning to the roots of each tradition, except for those roots are second edition, not first edition, and also updated. So there's this strange sense of progress, but with simplification that I find interesting. Like we get rid of the agamate, that there is some sort of ritualized death phenomenon for the Euthanatoi, but a trip to the underworld is not necessary anymore. And as you said, the biggest change is kind of with the crafts. We get the idea of the Disparate Alliance, this group of people who believes that yes, the technocracy is the enemy, but because they have been tainted by the Nefandi. If we were to get a Guide to the Traditions M20 edition, where do you think it should go?
If we were to have a guide to the traditions in M20, I think I would want a really heavy hand with the future fates. Because the thing I've discovered about the traditions and mage is they mean different things to different people. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have had a firm opinion on exactly what they should look like. And I am not that mage fan anymore. I would like a book that openly acknowledges how many different things the traditions have been to different people and presents a narrative and builds the world a bit, but spends most of its time saying, okay, if you want this to be what the traditions are from people that know how this works, here's how you can invoke that. If you want this other thing, here's how you can invoke that. You know, what if you leave all the crafts in the traditions? How can you do that? How can we pull that idea forward in a way that's maybe a little less imperialist? How can we adjust the narrative? I like mage to be accessible, and especially where the traditions are concerned, I feel like the waters are muddy, and it's one of the hardest things for players to pick up and go, I know what I'm looking at. In a perfect world, I'd love a whole new edition to do a bigger clean sweep, but for an M20 tradition book, I think I would want a tool set for storytellers that help them build a world so at least at their table, at their microcosm, they know how to describe the traditions in a way that both aligns with how they want to run them and will make sense to a new player. I don't know how to point anyone to that in the current books.
Yeah, stereotypes are super useful in RPGs to get people started. To be like, yeah, the Verbena are witches. People are like, Verbena equal witch, done. And like with that level of granularity, you can dive in real fast. But the flip side is if someone's like, I don't see myself in this game, how many groups do you need to cover those bases? if we are pointing at the traditional gamer, traditional is in pretty heavy scare quotes there, for listeners at home who can't see my jazz hands. It does make sense for the virtual adepts and the Sons of Aether to be different. But then you start talking about like, oh, let's compare this to the gaming public who we would like to have play our games. Do they need to be different? Probably not. If the idea in M20 is that the crafts are no longer outside of the Ascension conflict and are willing to take the fight to the technocracy, I would want to see some groups that still meet the traditional definition of craft, who still try and have nothing to do with it, whether that be like a wizard's cloister of some sort, trying to solve a very particular magic problem, or that are really attending to a particular community and don't care about anything else. I think by the craft stepping up to be at that different place, as you said, on the organization timeline compared to the traditions, that frees up that idea. I think I would also want to see something on political movements within the council, that fight between let's reconstruct the Council of the Nine and then other people who want to go in different directions. We were talking about second edition and whether or not it updated things. Each tradition kind of had in its past a period where it was the bee's knees. The virtual adepts starting in the 40s and 50s, the Society of Aether at the turn of the previous century with the electrification of everything. I'd say through World War I, the Hermetics during the High Mythic Age, the Vibane in a time before that, Dream Speakers in an ancient time before the Gauntlet rose. I would want to see a conversation on what are the groups that might be the next tradition. What is the group then that fills the role that the Hollowers used to have? If you mentioned sweeping the decks for M5, what would you want that to look like? Do you have any idea?
I'm sure I'm about to piss off a bunch of people, and so like at me when we're done. I really like the design approach V5 took with wiping away a lot of the bloodlines, but also leaving the bloodlines in the form of lore sheets. And I think that required taking a very different approach to describing the clans. And really, I'd like something similar for M5. I would really like to see a take on the traditions that makes them much more abstract, that says, okay, this whole Council of Nine thing happened. The canon exists, but really, the Dream Speakers isn't a political organization that has a coherent seat at this council, because really they never played that way. Like none of the traditions in actual games ended up playing really like political organizations that I've been in or seen. I'm sure there are people that leaned into that, but it seemed much more rare than the other games. I would really like to see a transition like that where there's something that is you're a necromancer, whatever that means to you, based on your paradigm. And then you can pick that. I can say that's the first thing I pick as building my character. But just because you picked that does not mean you owe any fealty to the Council of Nine.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you can say, I'm independent. I have fealty to the Council of Nine. I'm, a necronaut within the technocracy. Let the traditions be a standalone organization that different people from different beliefs and groups have fealty to. Same thing with the technocracy. Let it exist and say, when everything's shattered, they still really haven't put everything back together, and maybe have a new vision for that starting to happen, but have that transition make everything a lot more flexible. Because while the crafts have expanded and there's been an attempt to give more of a place outside the traditions for a lot of different sorts of character types, to your point, the crafts really do serve a very different place. Suddenly getting them involved in the Ascension War, while it makes them more approachable and in the story also dilutes some of that. And there are a couple concepts that don't have a really great place, like Necromancer. There are a couple groups, but then you're tied to like a very specific cultural representation. And I want something more flexible. I want something more like, pick your big group, that's great. Now pick your lore sheet, pick your affiliation. And those two things don't need to be tightly linked.
There may be some correlation between the two, but it wouldn't be a very strong one necessarily. You could not infer from one the other, in the
Yeah.
same way that we got rid of the association between tradition and affinity sphere. If you can come up with a story justification, do whatever you want. And kind of my hope is something similar. I would like the magic type and the political view to be different things that you pick. I don't know organizationally how this would work, and this starts to look a bit like the way that Mage the Awakening does it. I like the idea that you could be part of a group of necronauts or people that generally explore the underworld, but politically you may have radically different ideas of what the role of magic should be in the world, or how the Ascension War should be won, in the same way that I'm part of an opera company and we are not all on the same page politically. And I would love to see that there is some affinity group for people who are very good with fire magic, or where religion is very important in their work. I don't have a good answer to what that necessarily looks like. One of the things I really liked about Revised was that it was very roll your own. The idea was, as you learned more, your paradigm would change. You would probably start out with something very doctrinaire, but over time that would adjust. And that was one of their ways of getting away from focusing on real world practices. Your paradigm could be rigid. What I do is right and everyone else is wrong. It could be closed, that mine is right and others exist, but they are incomplete. Open, that there are many paradigms and I add elements from others, but this is what I'm used to and this is what makes the most sense to me. And liberal, that all paradigms are true and the parts are interchangeable, but there was never a system for that. And I don't know how you balance adding a system to that with making it something that is in any way approachable for a new person. And that is always kind of where I smack my head against things.
I actually think having a system for that would make parts of the game much more accessible, because one thing that I've always struggled with explaining to my players is, really, guys, you can build a single magical effect. You just need to come up with a way for your paradigms to intersect. I like the idea, even if it's just like a series of advantages and disadvantages around, is my character really capable of that? I think it's interesting to, say, make a character where I just believe everything is interchangeable and I can go through a completely different set of motions where internally I am worshiping the face of God that I recognize. And it's fine that I'm working with a pagan because they're just engaging with different aspects of the one. And that doesn't threaten my sense of paradigmatic identity, as opposed to someone else who is like, no, you're wrong. You're not working magic. That's just, I'll explain it away. And that dynamic, the difference, the spectrum of those experiences are something I find a lot of players struggle with. Mm-hmm. And I think if you systematized that, while the system would be complicated, it would be a system that you could sit down and struggle with for a bit. And once you got it, you wouldn't just, cool, I know how the system works now. I think you'd actually get a part of the game narratively that has never really been well explained.
So your character could essentially have a rating in metaphysical cooperativeness. And
that's kind of what I'm thinking.
You could have the 3-point flaw of doctrinaire. You can only work with people who are the same. Or if you cooperate with other people, it takes 20% longer and the number of threshold successes increases by 2, because even your avatar is like, what horseshit is this? Or you could take the 3-point merit liberal in that, and this was something that was actually introduced in Revised. If you saw someone do a magical effect, you could echo their paradigm, practice, and instruments as long as you had the appropriate spheres, but you could get there if you had seen someone else do it. And I thought that was neat. I guess the other key system change I would also want to do is, this is also one of those, I don't know if it would make things harder or easier, but the idea of your character could pick spheres in which they were fast, slow, or ritual to basically answer the question of, can I do this instantly in combat? That would represent having a ability to say, yeah, I can step sideways, but it's always going to take me an hour and a half to do it because that's my slow sphere. It takes me a while to build up to it or something. That kind of system doesn't work too well just because of conjunctional effects. And then I was floating this idea and someone's like, yeah, just whatever the lead sphere is. I'm like, okay, what do we do when we're teleporting into the Umbra with Correspondence 3, Spirit 3? What's the lead sphere? And it's like, oh, that gets harder.
I like that idea. I think what might be more approachable instead of it being a total sphere thing is if they put a little bit more structure around rotes and individual powers. So stepping sideways might be something where, they have some more descriptions of that power and you can't just jump sideways unless you get some extraordinary number of successes. If you try to do it in combat, the number of successes dictate how many rounds it takes. So there's a teleportation power in Changeling that's like that. You can roll, and if you get one success to teleport, it's going to take 5 rounds. You succeeded, but you still have to deal with the next 5 rounds of combat. I also feel like it could set a better balance around dynamic magic and not dynamic magic. I love the dynamic part of Mage. I don't tend to use a lot of rotes. But every time dynamic magic comes up in combat, I am always kind of left thinking, we're playing some narrative shorthand here. Does this make sense? And I think putting some more system around, if you want to be able to do something in the 6 seconds that a combat action represents and have a decent chance of it, it needs to be a rote. It needs to be something you have learned, which is also going to let you actually balance combat actions. If you want to do something big and dynamic to like push the story, go nuts. You have some time to experiment. You're a mage. You get to change reality, but it takes more than 6 seconds to figure it out. And I think building a real usable, beneficial rote system is a really nice place to explore what you just described instead of it just being like that whole sphere over there.
This is why people who are good at systems are, but yeah, as a storyteller, I have the exact same tensions. The way I do it is I've kind of shifted it sideways, where you can only do an instant action if it is either a rote or the highest sphere is no more than half your arete rounded down. So for my players, when they hit arete 5, that meant suddenly they could do two dot sphere effects like instantaneously. Sorry, with arete 4. And when they hit arete 6, suddenly they could just pull 3 dot effects kind of off the cuff. And that was an additional thing I threw in that so far has worked. When we both get through a backlog of 123 other Storyteller Vault publications, we should come back to this as an idea.
Yeah, I like that idea, and I really like that system because that is an advantage for archmages that make them scale in power in a way that feels very archmage appropriate, but it doesn't fundamentally break the game the way the old archspheres did. Like, It feels realistic. Yeah, I would love to explore that more.
Yeah. Where do you put the balance in a tradition between hewing to real world practices and having something that is fundamentally different than what human cultures do?
Yeah, this is actually a big part of why I would love the traditions to become totally separate from the real world organization, because I think that gives more room for, I've got a crazy fantasy idea and I want to explore it. And it doesn't turn into, I'm playing a cultural group and I'm just like steamrolling authentic representation. I'd really like those things to be pulled apart. I feel like it's a fantasy game. It's an RPG. There needs to be some space to just experiment and have fun. And that's tough to do when you're dealing with real world cultures. That's definitely something I struggle with. I think where I fall on that a lot of the time is it depends on the setting. So in a truly magical fantasy world where Mage LARP worked, for example, and we were running a big public game that anyone could walk through the door, someone who was from, a culture that's represented, I think that sweet spot hews much closer to respect the cultures you're invoking. At your individual table, I think you know who's there. You should be very sensitive to respect the cultures of the people who are there. You should definitely try to avoid just like perpetuating terrible stereotypes, but I do think there's more leeway to experiment there and not negatively impact someone. I think navigating this stuff, you need to think about what is the real world impact of what I'm doing. And with something like the Society of Ether, go nuts. It's this like they don't really exist. Have fun. Same with the virtual adepts.
You're not being respectful of the pseudoscientific beliefs of people who think that orgone accumulators are real, Victor, and I'm tired of this.
And I never will be.
Exactly.
At the same time, if you are playing, a couple away, I think you should spend some time to read up on the culture you're representing. And maybe you don't have to get every single practice right, but you should invoke the right deities. You should spend some time to at least present a fantasy representation that speaks to your respect for that culture. Not that you're just picking it up to have a good time.
Yeah. Do not joyride other people's magical beliefs.
Basically, yes. I think that sweet spot is actually probably in a different place for each group, because I know there are some cultures where, for various reasons, they want other people to pick up their traditions and use them so they can continue to be spoken and exist. I've heard especially from cultures where the history of their traditions are right on the edge of extinction, where the consensus there is, no, we want to be remembered. We want this to be out there. We will engage with people and try to help them understand as much as we can, but they don't have the same strong appropriation response that a lot of people do. It's complicated.
To kind of put down some guardrails, I think one is cultures often have a spectrum of sacredness, of things that go from custom to things that aren't even spoken of. So, for instance, you could say the lowest level of sacredness could be something like take off your shoes before you walk into someone's house. Like there is the notion of keeping another person's home clean. Things like that, those courtesies, I think we can generally effortlessly weave those in. And one, if you get them wrong, the stakes are low. And two, if you get them right, one, your heart is kind of in the right place, and two, you're showing that you did a little bit of homework. And then on the other end, there are just things that shouldn't ever enter a game. That a culture may have a high god that is never invoked. The culture may have a sacred material or ingredient or essence or act or something like that. And to me, that is something the players just shouldn't be touching unless they have a lot of firsthand understanding of it. The second thing I generally look at is the balance between getting the word out, as it were, and possible misrepresentation. So Victor talked about certain cultures who are like, no, we want to be remembered. And there was an interview recently in The Economist talking about a particular temple who was like, tourism is the only thing that will allow our particular sect to continue. And if I need to sell a slightly misrepresentative fat Buddha to keep the doors open so that I can maintain this monastery, I am perfectly fine with that. It's one of those things where not all aspects of a culture can be commercialized, thank goodness, despite the syndicate's best efforts in a lot of cases. Most cultures will have a view on that. My rule at my table is I want it to be between, for anyone who wants to reflect a real world paradigm, I want it to be between 1/3 and 2/3 real, as in grounded in actual practices. So I have one particular character who is a atheist, more or less an atheist Catholic, like very much is a member of the Celestial Chorus, has never had divine experience, but recognizes that everyone else does and believes strongly in the community that churches create. This is a character that does not use prime, but uses primal community as their sphere, which is just kind of a revamping of primal utility. So instead of having a large business that they extract quintessence from, they will have a community group that they are able to draw quintessence from. It gets kind of complicated when you have to come up with a narrative justification of how their lightning gun is recharged by bringing it to a potluck, but we've gotten through so far. And so when he calls upon the power of a particular saint, if that saint is associated with olives, a starling, as a bird in the color blue, the awakened practitioner may also associate a piece of onyx with it in addition to the other things, and may replace that starling with the European robin with the whatever symbology they use to do an effect. 1/3 to 2/3, check to see if there's anything truly sacred to the culture that just outsiders are considered banned from. Even if the character is a member of that culture, I feel like that extends to the player. Do you want to know the one I have the most difficulty with?
Yes, I would love to hear that, because always trying to navigate this.
Hermetics. I have difficulty with magical paradigms that steal things from other paradigms. Like the postmodernism of the Hollowers, I generally get. The idea that, okay, you think this image is sacred and I can run with that. And in most cases, the Hollowers are picking up on subverting dominant culture. So if suddenly there were like a Hollower who's going to ironically worship the Loa, I would have a problem with that as a storyteller. But within the Order of Hermes, you're like, okay, you've stolen a whole bunch of Egyptian mysticism, like a whole bunch of esoteric Jewish belief, and then repurposed it. And it works because it's mage. But do I want your character reinforcing a misinterpretation of what the Sephiroth is? That's the part where I'm like, I guess the thing that I have a problem with is because it is both hard for me to navigate morally, and also it comes up a lot more than someone being like, yeah, I really want to lean into a Nupiak magic. But to me, the Order of Hermes is one of the real big ones that I have issues with in figuring out how realistic, quote unquote, I want it to be. Yeah, it's real world, but do we want it to be?
Well, yeah. And the thing about that is that's also getting into an aspect of Hermeticism that is part of the real world. Do we want to authentically represent what Hermeticism is without critiquing it? I mean, back when I was a practicing neo-pagan, I wanted to start learning about the Kabbalah, and I was, at a get-together with some other pagans, and I made a comment about wanting to find a Jewish book on Kabbalah. I looked at a couple Kabbalah books from the occult section, and they all left a bad taste in my mouth. And by looked at, I mean flipped through to see if I wanted to read them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other witches there just said, "Oh, well, I mean, I don't know about that." And I was just so struck by it. And the first book that I did read on the Kabbalah was recommended to me by a friend who is Jewish and the daughter of a rabbi. It's a book that other Jewish people that I've known have said, that is a good book for an outsider to read. It keeps everything in a very specific scope and doesn't include things that are inappropriate for people from the outside. And I'm really glad that that's the first book that I read. But that moment has always kind of stuck in my maw, as it were. And to me, like, if you want to try and balance this and you want to try and have the Hermetics there and represent them the way they really are, that should be a problem that you have to grapple with in story. And I know a lot of Hermetic players disagree with me on that. I think it's important.
To me, the cornerstone of Hermeticism in Mage is the idea of study, 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 and working really hard, and then high ritual and explosions. So whenever I have a Hermetic player, we do not use Hermetic sources, but we use what I would call Hermetic belief, if that makes sense. That there was some sort of wisdom in the ancient world that by pouring through these ancient manuscripts, you can find something. It's going to be a lot of work, but there's going to be payoff to it. So whenever I deal with a Hermetic in-game, we almost rewrite Hermeticism in terms of what texts are used and such from scratch. And that is a case where I don't feel bad not hewing to history, and that's me. So do you want to spitball some ideas on what you could make the traditions instead of what they are currently?
Yeah, in terms of changing the traditions, talked a little bit about what M5 could look like and just totally rethinking them from a game design standpoint. But if I thought just more narratively, stayed in the world, I would really like to see the traditions cover more. I'd love to see another kind of shift similar to what happened when the virtual adepts joined, the Etherites joined, or when the Solificati or the Bettini left, that maybe gave some of the current traditions the freedom to reinvent themselves, maybe even reform the council with a few more groups. When I think about what, say, the Bettini represented when they were first introduced to the game, and they were first introduced because basically all of Muslim belief was absent, and say, okay, it's great that a group was written for that after the fact, but what if we reorganize things and brought maybe not the Bettini, but some other fraction of the Bettini back in and represent a different religious view of things? Because high religion is kind of limited to the choristers,
Mhm.
breaking up some of these concepts and, to your point earlier, giving people an easier time seeing themselves in the game on the first read through. I'd really like to see that. I don't know what the best way to accomplish that is, but I feel like that would be my mission statement, where you could pick up the game, read through the groups you'd expect to be in the base book. So we'll say the traditions, and see yourself in the game. I'd really like to see that.
I find it interesting because in Vampire, Islam is reflected in each tradition has an more or less an Islamic sect to it, where you have the Ashira, I believe, that are kind of that reflection. The Levantine technocratic group that was invited to the Convention of the Ivory Tower. I don't recall the name off the top of my head. Do you?
I believe it was the Makhtashaf al Nur
Thank you.
originally, and
Yeah.
I think that name may have been changed at some point because with so many cultural names that were introduced early in the game, it's maybe a bit gibberish, and I forget what it was changed to. But I definitely think it's the Makhtashaf al Nur that you're thinking of.
Yeah. And I like the idea that, like, what happens if we get 25 traditions? So, one, we could make the Council of the Nine. It wouldn't be the Nine anymore, but it could be like the UN of Mystics, where it really wouldn't do much except for maybe trade information and keep things. Keep mages up to date on maybe massive threats to the Tellurian. And I don't know about you, but if we basically have two groups that represent balance in the world of Mage, that frees up space to have multiple groups represent other parts of the metaphysical trinity. Like, I don't know about you, but like, I think it would be fascinating if the Knights Templar or a group of the choristers are like, hey, the Gabrielites were really onto something. We need to bring that back. And suddenly you have two static groups. One is technological, one is not, and takes advantage of like the power of religious revival or something around the world to try and affect a new paradigm. Or if the Nefandi have an amazing amount of diversity within them, which is a weird ass statement to say out loud. And there is already competition within that. Rethinking the traditions also allows us to rethink a bunch of other things and allows us to have, to me, more weird mashups. Like, to me, it is an accident that the Society of Ether are mad scientists. I would love to see another tradition that focused strictly on the doctrine of embracing all from the Kitab. I mentioned the idea that the cultists are this odd mix of seers and explorers. We have the tenders of the wheel within the Akashiyana, as well as in the Euthanatoi. Like, what if they got together? Like, what if we finally got that explosion of sub-Saharan African traditions? The idea of the Balamob is reintroduced in M20. We get the Itza'at and the Thunder Society as well. Like, what is the organization that allows us to include those? What if we finally get a group of magical extremists? What if people don't jump onto Zoroastrianism, but they jump onto old school Toftani belief that just says if we summon enough paradox, the threads of reality will weaken. And suddenly we have this extremist group within inside the mage world, and they're not marauders. Or alternatively, they're much closer to first edition marauders, and that could be a tradition. They're taking the fight to the technocracy. They certainly believe in ascension. They just want to do it by loosening the threads of reality, and they're certainly taking part in the ascension conflict. There would be space for a Levantine scholastic group. We have the era of early Christianity where there were just kind of some somewhat small doctrinal differences, but very common intellectual heritage among a bunch of early Christian, and that period of time where they were referred to as Christian Jews as a phenomenon, where like, oh no, we believe in Jesus, but we also keep kosher because he is not a break from the tradition, but an extension of it. One of the cool things about Mage is it allows us to extend past beliefs forward. Like, if you want the Albigensian heresy to have succeeded in the awakened world, we can suddenly have a tradition that includes a whole bunch of anchorites in it. I agree. I think it frees up a lot of space, and suddenly we can have these interesting collectives of things. I don't know if the game breaks down when you do that, when you just start introducing more traditions. Maybe the council splits into some other number of groups. Have you ever thought of like rethinking fundamentally what a tradition is? Like, one of the thoughts I had was, what if you couldn't join a tradition until you were a master? And it was almost like grad school, but for magic, that you can practice whatever you want, but you can't truly become a traditional member until you reach this certain level of excellence. And until then, most mages kind of had to cobble their own paradigm together.
I haven't, but I've always been tempted. And the only real reason I haven't played around with that is the particular group of players that I play mage with are pretty hardcore World of Darkness, I'll say traditionalists themselves. Two of my regular playing group had previously written for the games. And as a storyteller, I spend a lot of time sort of going, all right, what invocations am I going to be able to pull up that are going to satisfy my players? I would love to play around with that kind of radical rethinking, but I think I would need players that weren't bringing quite so many preconceptions to the table
Mm-hmm.
that I have to navigate. I really like that idea of you don't join a tradition until you reach a certain level of enlightenment. The entire dynamic in the narrative about, well, if you are a euthanatos, and if you are a euthanatos, that means you went through experience to be awakened. I feel like it really leaves out a lot of 1 and 2 Arete mages because it doesn't make sense that your backstory would have something that profound in it. You went into the underworld. You have seen the entire realms beyond, but you're a 1 Arete mage. And I think there should be a place for 1 Arete mages. First level spheres do a lot more than most players do with them. And I like the idea that there could be a whole tier of play where you aren't a member of a tradition, or at the very least, you don't know you're a member of tradition. I think it makes a lot more sense that, maybe the Order of Hermes is grooming you, but they haven't pulled the veil back, and you still think you're just going to your local high ritual coffee clatch at the occult bookstore in your home city, and that's fine. And maybe you found out there are vampires in the world, and that's new, and your mind is totally and completely blown by it because you're like a 2 Arete mage and you only 2 Arete like a month ago.
Oh,
You
interesting.
know,
So every tradition would have some sort of magical front group. For instance, you could join the Church of Perpetual Glory or something like that, and you learn how to do simple miracles. And it's not even until you reach Arete 3 that someone says, oh, by the way, we're actually the Celestial Chorus, and there's other people doing magic out there. And it goes from maybe you know that there are vampires and faith-based magic in existence to, as your Arete increases, you just find out more of the weird stuff that is running around the Tellurian. Or there's deliberate misinformation, and maybe every group has this set of feeder groups, and then there is another group that's like, no, anyone we find, almost like heretics in Wraith, who are like, no, we must tell all the full panoply of magic to everyone all the time.
something along those lines, I really like the idea of. I also feel like it would make it much easier to do an introductory street level mage game. And I am all about making those first level mage experiences make a little bit more sense.
One note for completeness, we have completely ignored fellowships from Dark Ages Mage. To me, they are kind of a fundamentally different beast. I am not familiar with Dark Ages Mage. I know some people who are, and when we get to it, we're going to do an episode specifically on that. So just in case you were curious, you didn't touch on the Spirit Talkers or the precursors to the Ali Batin. Just for the sake of completeness, I wanted to make sure we mentioned that. We got 1 or 2 questions regarding that, and you are not being ignored. So we've had a big conversation on traditions and such. Anything else before we wrap up, or any final thoughts or advice on how a storyteller or players can rethink this?
I guess the thing that I would recommend is know your players and curate how much you share with them. My husband, the first time he tried to play Mage, he read, I think, the revised write-ups on the traditions, and it was shortly before M20 came up, so M20 wasn't available yet. And his immediate response is, these people are all crazy. Like, these people are all legitimately insane. How am I supposed to play any of this? And it took a while of getting in and explaining Mage, and then M20 came out and he gelled with those write-ups a little bit better. But know the way your players react to things. And especially if they're new, really curate what you share with them, because just handing a book over, even dealing just with the traditions, is a challenge.
I guess my biggest thing is if you start changing these, feel comfortable adding rules that back up the themes and ideas that you want to get across. To me, tradition membership should have a mechanical benefit to it in some way, shape, or form. I've tooled around with the idea of coming up with lore sheet style things where someone could have 3 dots in Sahaja or what have you, and that could represent different things for different groups. That you and I talked before about the Fragile Path, and in it, Sister Bernadette speaks entirely in song. And if you think that music is the language of the universe and this brings you closer to the divine, then you're going to talk entirely in song. That's not weird at all. So the idea of a tradition being a paradigm gets you there real quick. If it's a political group, it's a little bit weaker. But at the same time, if it's a political group, you're doing something to advance a cause, and other people are going to be expecting things out of you. Every tradition may have the large swathe of people who are almost like college graduates who don't interface with the tradition. They just got their ideology there and did the training and paid their time and paid back their mentor or what have you. But there are those group of people that continue to go back to actively support it, and there should be a benefit to go with that cost. And I would think about systematizing that in some way. And if you reinterpret what the traditions are, the mechanics should support that. But that's part of my overall belief that mechanics, system, and setting should all kind of reinforce each other. And with that, Victor, thank you so much for being on. I look forward to seeing what you do next with Walking Away from Arcadia, as well as your numerous mage projects, and I hope to have you on again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Mage the Podcast, which will be declared a Old World of Darkness piece of intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO in the year 2139. The show is made possible by the executive producers, who include Anders S., Andrew K., Andrew E., Brendan, Bryce Perry, Christopher P., Chris Zach, Ira Grace, Jenna F., Justin B., John H., John Magnuson, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, William C., William M., and Jason Cern. Today's shout-out is to noted exobiologist and xenolinguist Christopher P. As the first human to make contact with a great race of Yith embedded in the ice of Antarctica before they were wiped out by the flying polyps millions of years ago, but whose powers allow them to swamp minds with humans, we appreciate your work to decode their plans to save themselves by replacing human minds in the future. Your quick thinking to point at PewDiePie and go, "Do not take over our minds, for we have already fallen to those beyond," may have saved humanity. If you'd like to become an executive producer like Christopher P., get a chat color in Discord, and have me make up things about you periodically, as well as receiving our executive producer-only podcast, So What You Plan, you can become one by clicking on Become a Supporter in the show notes or through the episode entries on our webpage. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We read every message. We also have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Podcasts, or the podcatcher of your choice. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to Mage the Podcast for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.